As the number of tiers in your application increases, you will have to make asynchronous calls. Now that can be a little bit involved, and depending on which technique you use, there might be some confusion as how to use it. So let's walk through some scenarios of how this can be achieved. As you can see here, I have an open folder called Asynchronous, and I have within it a public directory that will hold my static files. And outside of that, I have the server files, and I have two scenarios there, one called easy and the other one called index. So let's start out here with the easy. And as you can see here, this is an express application that is identifying the public directory for static files. That's where they're going to be served from. And in addition to that, I simply have one route, and this is a route that is showing you how to create, or giving you the API to create a user. Now this route itself is going to be calling another function, and the reason I have it here as two separate pieces, although I'm simply just echoing what was passed in, is that later, when we don't look at the easy case, we will look at how we can arrange a test file to consider the scenario where we're calling additional tiers from the server side as well. Say you're calling to the database or you're calling to some other service. So as you can see here, this is something pretty simple. We simply have one route. That route is within it calling a function, and that function is simply creating an object with those three parameters, name, email, and password, and echoing that back. So let's go ahead and run the server. And so as you can see here, I am in the same location in the terminal. And if I look at my files, you can see there the files that I have. This is a pretty flat application. It just has a couple of files, and I'm requiring, or I have added the express package. So I'm going to go ahead and run easy. So I'll enter node easy. And as you can see there, that is running on port 3000. So now let's go ahead and hit that through the browser. And as you can see there, we get the object back as expected. Now, if we move to the editor and we open up here the files that we have, and let's start off here with the easy one. I'll go ahead and wrap my code. And you can see here that we have something pretty simple. I have the path that I'm going to hit, which is the same path that I just hit in the browser, which is creating Peter at mit.edu/secret. So that is the name, username, and password. And then I have here a function that's called create. And this function is going to reach out and hit this endpoint with that path. Now you'll notice here that I have a .then, and then after that I have one more .then. And so what this is doing is reaching out to that endpoint, and then is bringing back that response, and is trying to parse that response as JSON. And if that is successful, then we get one more step, which is .then data. And then we're going to go ahead and write that to the console, just the data that came back. And we're going to invoke that function from the function below here. So we're going to call create with the function invoke. And I will be making these calls here at the console on the browser. And the only other thing to note is that just to know which file we're in, I have an h1 here that is, and that's used just as a label. And you can see there that I have super agent, but we're not going to use that for now. So let's go ahead and load that page into the browser. And as mentioned, that is easy.html. So let's go ahead and enter easy.html. And as you can see there, we get a nice big header. Let's go ahead and open up our developer tools. And I'm going to go ahead and move this up. And before I continue, let me just change my theme and my editor just to keep the browser and the editor apart. And now let's go ahead and use the invoke function. And as expected there, we get back the object. So Peter peterparker@mit.edu, and so on. Well, that worked pretty well, but what if we wanted to return that data? Let's say we enter here, return data, and then we entered here console.log, and we wrapped create, right, which is the function we're calling, and we should be getting back that return data, right? So let's go ahead and reload the page to get the new code, and we'll go ahead and rerun invoke. And as you can see here, this time we got nothing. So what's going on? Well, if we look at it closely, we'll see that this is a function that is within another function, and it is returning then to that function. So what if we did something like this, right? So let's go ahead and save that. Let's go ahead and reload the page, invoke once again. And now you can see there that we are getting back something called a promise. So what do we do with a promise? Well, as you can see there, fetch itself is going through a number of stages, and it is doing this .then. And it turns out that you can use promises in a way that allows you to wait for the response. And so you can read a lot more details about what a promise is and how it's implemented. But for now, I'll show you simply here the functionality. So instead of doing this here, what we can do is we know we are going to get back a promise. So then what we can do is enter then, and then we can pick up the response. So in this case, I'm going to call it response. And I'm using the fat arrows notation there. And now we'll enter console.log. And inside of here, we will enter the response. So let's go ahead and reload our page once again. Enter invoke. And as you can see there, now we get the response once again. And let me go ahead and annotate here response simply to show that we are getting it from that point. And I'll go ahead and invoke one more time. And as you can see there, we get response and we get Peter, the Peter object. So let me make an observation here. There's nothing wrong with handling the response at this point and making, say, some changes to the UI. However, when you want things to happen in a certain sequence and you want to have control of when those updates are made, either to the UI or some other tier that you're calling, then you would want to use a different approach. One where you're getting the response back and then you're taking, say, another step. So this is the easy scenario. Let me show you here some variations. And these are variations from the client still. And later we will take a look at some of what can happen in the server. So let's go ahead and open up the other file, the one called index, and I'm going to close easy here. And as you can see here, I have something similar. I have a couple of functions and then an accompanying invoke function, as you can see here. And so let's go ahead and take a look at the first one. This one is once again calling the same path. So we're still creating the Peter object. And as you can see here, inside of it, this one I'm calling create await. And inside of it here, I'm using different notation. I'm using await, and because the language requires any function that uses await to be async, I'm using async as well. And so you can see here that I fetch that path, I wait, and then I extract the JSON and I await for that as well. Now you can see here that I am invoking that function right below it, and you can see here that I have console.log response. Let's go ahead and put a colon here. And then I'm calling create await, which returns data, as you can see. Now let's go ahead and load that into the browser. And so this is simply the root path. And you can see there that this one is called asynchronous. And now let's go ahead and call, and this is invoke one, as you can see there. And so that is this function here. So I'm going to go ahead and invoke. Now, as you can see here, we have gotten once again a promise. So one of the things that we could do here is that we could await once again, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and reload the page. So let me go ahead and wrap that up here. And that threw me there for a minute because usually the error is a little bit, it's more indicative of what's taking place. And actually all that's happening is that because we're using await, we can't use that inside of a function that's not asynchronous. And so if we go ahead and reload the page now, and we invoke once again, you can see there that we get the result we're looking for. However, if you look at it closely, you'll see that we have a promise that is pending, and then we actually get the results, which means that this works here in the console, but if we were doing it in the code, we would get, again, that empty, undefined response if we were calling for something before the promise was resolved. So as before, we can solve this by removing the async and removing the await, and then using the .then notation, which takes a callback, and this will be here the response. And we're then going to use the console.log, and in this case, I'll enter here response twice, one for the label and one for the variable. And so now we can go ahead and try it again. Let's go ahead and reload our code. And as you can see now, we do not see the promise anymore, and we see response and we see the object. So now let's take a look here at the super agent, and I'm calling the function there super agent with a promise, and then the invocation is invocation 2. And as you can see here, I am returning the response body, which should be that Peter object. And then I am writing to the console here and calling that function. So let's go ahead and clear our console here, and we'll invoke that second function. And as you can see there, once again, we get that undefined because that did not return as expected. And what we can do here is that in itself, it's already returning a promise. And so what we can do is we can remove this part here, simply enter return superagent. And then within the invoking function, I'm going to go ahead and simply enter here .then. Then that is going to take the callback that we have been writing. And this is going to be the console.log that we have been writing as well. So let's enter response. Let's go ahead and save that file. Go ahead and reload the page. And we'll invoke it again. And as you can see there, now we get the payload back. Now this is the full response. If we wanted to get access to that object, we can enter body here. Gonna go ahead and call again, and now we get the clean Peter object. So as you can see there are a few alternatives as to how you use the asynchronous scenario, but once you go through it a couple of times, it should clear up as to how you can use it. Now let's go ahead and move to the server side, and what happens to the server side when you have some asynchronous call that you need to make. Let's say you're calling some other service, or more commonly you're calling a database. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. And well, let me remind you first what we did. As you will recall, we called here the path to be able to create a user, and that called another function that simply wrapped those parameters in an object, and that was what we sent back. Now on index here, I'm doing the same thing. However, notice that I am using a .then. And so I am passing the parameters onto create, but something else is happening in create, which requires me to use the dot then. That is, I'm dealing with a promise. And once I deal with dot, that comes back, I can then wrap that into response.send, which is what we typically do. And I'm here also accounting for the case in where I get an error. Now, what is this other function? If you take a look at this function here, this is simply simulating something that is slow. And so I have a set timeout here. Again, something asynchronous. But I am using, and I'm creating here for the very first time, although we have been using promises, we have been using things that have promises, not created a promise. And so in this case, I am creating a promise, and I'm using the keywords of resolved and reject. And those are the two keywords that we can use to put a placeholder in the computation for when that gets resolved, that parameter will return. And so we have two cases, right? One successful, one unsuccessful. So in this case, you can consider here the scenario where you called, say, your database, and this was resolved successfully, and then you can return to the calling function. Or if you had an error, you can reject it, and that will be caught also from the calling side function. So again, this is simulating some call to something that is somewhere else, say a database, and that in this case it's a bit slow, so I'm making it wait for 2 seconds. And here is the path, right? So let's go ahead and see how we can call this. And for this, we simply need to run the other page, the other file. And so I'm going to go back to the console, to the terminal, clear, and in this case run, instead of easy, I'm going to go ahead and run index. And as you can see there, I have that running on the same port as well. And let's go ahead and invoke that with the easy client as well. And so this is simply calling and waiting, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and hit that path here, easy.html. And actually, let me bring the console back so that we can see what happens server side. Let's go ahead and make it a little bit smaller so we can see the code at the same time. Okay, so let's go ahead and invoke. And as you can see there, we have a 2-second lag. Now, to emphasize what's taking place, let's go ahead and enter here a console.log. And let's say here ran to end. Let's go ahead and save, reload the page, invoke. And as you can see there, we see ran to end immediately, and 2 seconds later, we get the response. So this takes some getting used to initially, developing some comfort in asynchronous computation and coordinating or orchestrating the number of steps and making sure that the sequence that you think is taking place is in fact taking place. So I'm going to go ahead and post this code. You can go ahead and download it and play with it, and follow up with us if you have any questions.